In order to help me, a couple of logistics for this webinar. We ask that you please keep your microphones on mute throughout the event. Should you have a technical issue, my colleague Pranav can assist you if you message him through the chat box. During our sessions, we will have time for questions. To pose your question, please use the Q&A box, which is just next near the chat box. If we are not able to get to the question during the session, speakers may be able to respond to you in writing afterward. And finally, we will have a recording of this session available for those who are interested, and it will be available through the Sustainable Coconut Charter webpage soon after the webinar concludes. Have the next slide, please. Today, we have a full agenda featuring the launch of the Sustainable Coconut Charter. It is a milestone in a journey that began almost 2 years ago in Kuala Lumpur. After a few welcome remarks, we will turn to a couple of sessions focused on the environmental portion of the Sustainable Coconut Charter. First, we will explore the impact on biodiversity and conservation in the coconut sector. Second, we will look at the opportunities of sustainable coconuts production practices to improve the climate outcome. And lastly, we will have a few brief remarks from the representatives from the signatory companies before turning to an update on a project design led by GIZ that will help put the principles of the Charter into action in the Philippines. Before we get started, just given the number of companies participating in the Sustainable Coconuts Roundtable, we've been asked to remind participants that this roundtable will not be entering into any discussion, activity, or conduct that may infringe on its part or in the part of its members any applicable competition law. By way of example, members should not be discussing, communicating, or exchanging any commercially sensitive information, including information relating to prices, marketing and advertising strategy, costs, revenues, trading terms and conditions with third parties, including purchasing strategy, terms of supply, trade programs, or distribution strategy. And if that sounds like it came from a lawyer, it did. So thank you for trying to comply with that. The next slide, here we go. Without further delay, I'd like to turn to our opening remarks. First, we will hear from Stephen G. Olive. Next slide, please. Dr. Olive is the mission director of USAID's regional mission for Asia, based here in Bangkok. Unfortunately, he's not able to join us live today, but we are very grateful that he has graciously provided us a short video of his remarks and introduction. So go to the video, please.
Good afternoon. I am Dr. Steve Olive, and I am proud to be the Mission Director for the United States Agency for International Development's Regional Development Mission for Asia, based in Bangkok, Thailand. On behalf of USAID, I'd like to thank Barry Callebaut for spearheading a sustainable coconut and coconut oil roundtable, which is responsible for the momentous launch today. I would like to thank Grow Asia for its partnership and support for sustainable commodity sourcing in the region. When I first arrived in August 2020, the Sustainable Coconut Roundtable was one of the first initiatives I was briefed on. It truly embodies the U.S. government's priority to work through the private sector to catalyze reform and reduce greenhouse gas emissions. I commend this group for the forward thinking and willingness to engage proactively and preemptively to agree on this mutual commitment. USAID is proud to have supported this charter. While the coconut industry does not have widespread negative headlines of burning forest as other commodities have attracted, supply chains are often invisible, and only when there is a disruption do people realize the importance of sustainable supply chains. We will hear from speakers today who have looked at challenges in the current coconut supply chain, including some potentially negative environment and social impacts of current cultivation practices. This reminds us of how far we have to go to strengthen sourcing. It also reminds us of the importance of having a guiding tool like this charter to create a landscape approach for sustainability in Asia, home to the world's top coconut producers. This groundbreaking sustainable chapter is proof of what happens when competitors become collaborators. Later, we will hear how GIZ supported public-private partnerships in aligning their operations with the Charter's principles. The partnership involves 7 multinationals that are successfully cooperating on regional coconut sourcing. I look forward to their insights into the challenges and successes of early adoption. USAID Green Asia is one example of how we have initiatives dedicated to private sector and sustainable market reforms. This project identifies and helps scale sustainable land use businesses in Southeast Asia, providing them with an investment facilitation and capital matchmaking. Also, the $60 billion United States International Development Finance Corporation, which opened its doors in October of 2019, provides equity investment, insurance, and financing through loans to private companies. Another example of USAID's collaboration with the private sector is the Grow Coop project in the Philippines. We are working to support agriculture cooperatives in key value chains to facilitate direct co-opt and co-trading. Our support has increased the business bottom line while raising farmers' income. The challenge this charter addresses head-on is how will the market meet double-digit rise demand for coconut water, sugar, and oil when there aren't enough high-producing coconut trees to supply that demand? This is a complex challenge that is going to require creative problem-solving and collaboration. What I do know is that working collaboratively with the private sector is central to the solution. USAID stands ready to explore supporting the Charter's implementation and other related initiatives in partnership with governments, regional organizations, and the private sector. I wish you all continued success. I congratulate you on your collaboration and partnership, and I'm proud that USAID is a partner with you in this endeavor. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, and I appreciate the efforts from USAID's regional mission to have that statement available for us. Look at the next slide, please. I'm like to introduce Graham Dixie, who is the Executive Director of Grow Asia. Very pleased to have him join us today. Under Graham's leadership, Grow Asia works across stakeholder groups to convene and mobilize actors towards partnerships necessary to help solve some of the most challenging issues facing agriculture in the Asia region. So we are very pleased to have their support for today's event. Graham, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thanks very much, Christy, and thanks for that statement by Stephen. I mean, that was a very comprehensive, and it really painted an excellent picture of what you were doing. And this sustainability agenda is something that we've seen it growing, and something that you've been supporting, and it's an effort that we are wholly supportive of. And whatever way that the Grow Asia network can improve and help deliver on that, we will, whether that's through our central secretariat, through the regional programs, or particularly through the working groups and the task force that we have in the 6 countries that we work in. Just to step back for a second and think about multi-stakeholder partnerships. There are certain lessons that we have learned over time that are really key. One is, do you have a critical mass of partners? And clearly you're starting with some of the biggest players here, which is a great starting point. The second thing is, are people aligned? Have you got people all with a similar kind of vision? And what USAID has managed to do over the next 2 years is create that vision and create a plan about where they're going to go to. The third one that comes through is the criticality of measuring what they were doing and what you were doing. Finally, and probably one of the most important ones, is this point that Stephen made about the increasing demand for coconut products, which is a great start for being able to drive these processes forward. I would, though, just put one thing out there. When that partnerships are a bit like apple pie and motherhood. They're considered to be good things, which clearly they are. But then there is often an assumption made that they are easy to do. The science is, and this has been done by Harvard Business School, is that about half of all partnerships fail. And the reason that they fail is mainly due to one thing, which is people tend to underestimate the commitment, the resources and time that they require. And so I would just leave you that I hope that when you come together, that you recognize that this is a long process. It takes years for really to take off. It requires commitment. But like everything, success is often dependent on one word, persistence. Back to you, Christy.
Thank you, Graham. Those words of wisdom. I took notes because I think I need to weave those into my closing remarks. I think those were well said and well articulated. Finally, I would like to invite Oliver Van Hagen, who is the Sustainability Director for Global Ingredients with Barry Callebaut. He is responsible for developing and overseeing the implementation of the company's sustainability strategy for raw materials at a global level. So we're very pleased that he's able to have time to join us today and offer a few remarks about today's event and Barry Callebaut's role in that event, So Oliver, over to you.
Thanks, Christy. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Wherever you are, also on behalf of Barry Callebaut, I'd like to warmly welcome you to today's launching event of the Sustainable Coconut Charter. It's a real pleasure to see you all here visiting the event, attending the event, representing a great variety of organizations. The launch of the Sustainable Coconut Charter is another highlight in a series of important steps that we've been taking with so many of you over the past almost 2 years. In March 2019, we co-organized the first Sustainable Coconut Roundtable with our partners, the US Agency for International Development, USAID Green Invest Asia. It was a first of its kind event that brought together over 80 buyers, processors, and other actors actively involved in coconut supply chains to discuss sustainability challenges and share approaches to address these issues. The roundtable not only allowed us to establish a wide network of stakeholders interested in contributing to a more sustainable coconut sector, but the roundtable actually created a dynamic, a momentum that is still continuing. While the launch of the Sustainable Coconut Charter now is an important result of this dynamic, it only marks the beginning of a journey that we, together with the founding signatories, including AAK, Friesland Campina, Harmless Harvest, Nestle, and Unilever, pioneer, encourage all of you to join. The Charter is the first global sustainability charter in the coconut industry to harmonize buyer requirements, strengthen collaboration, develop supply, and improve farmers' incomes and livelihoods. Importantly, the Charter provides the basis to harmonize sustainability requirements and programs, to drive the alignment on focal areas, and support joint approaches to the challenges identified. After a long consultation process initiated in November 2019, the Charter provides a true benchmark for sustainability in the coconut sector. I guess all of us have seen in the past how important it is to agree on a harmonized approach to sustainability in landscapes and in supply chains. The Sustainable Coconut Charter provides the basis for this alignment. I encourage you to join us on this journey and show your commitment to sustainability in the coconut sector by signing the Charter. Now, you might ask yourself, and speakers before me have alluded to this, how this Charter can be put into action concretely on the ground. I'll not give you a response to that, but will point you to our dear colleague Matthias from the German Technical Cooperation, GIZ, who will later talk about a public-private partnership in the Philippines, which we embark on with Bunge, with Friesland Campina, JDE, Procter & Gamble, Nestle, and Unilever, and which will do exactly that. Lastly, I'd like to express my gratitude to everyone who has been involved in setting up this event, especially USAID Grow Asia, and everyone who in the past 2 years supported, facilitated, promoted, and joined us on the sustainable coconut journey. Thank you for your hard work. I'm confident that this movement will continue to grow by the day. And now, without further ado, let me wish you an interesting event with thought-provoking discussions and a set of inspiring speakers that we have lined up for today. Thank you.
Thank you, Oliver. Indeed, it has been quite a journey, and as you rightly point out, a lot of people have been involved in getting us to what I think is a very important milestone, which I believe you agree with as well. So without further ado, why don't we get on with our first session that helps to kind of articulate a little bit about what's the challenges and the issues that the Sustainable Coconut Charter is trying to address through one of the pillars around deforestation and climate change. Specifically, we'll be talking with a couple of speakers, Nitin Koka and Eric Maillard, who will offer us a bit of an outsider's perspective on the potential issues related to biodiversity and environmental sustainability facing the coconut industry. If I could have the next slide, please. My colleague, Phong Tran, who serves as USAID Green Invest Asia's Communication and Outreach Manager, but who in her former life was a successful journalist, will be moderating this session. So Phong, I'm going to turn this over to you.
It's my pleasure to sit in this seat for a bit. If you can confirm, Christy, that you can hear me all right, that'd be wonderful.
Yes, I hear you fine.
Okay, wonderful. So first we have Nitin Koka, who we're beaming straight in from California. He's an Asia-focused freelance journalist who covers supply chains across the region. And it was actually his months-long in-depth investigation into coconut sustainability with support from the US-based Pulitzer Center that brought him to our attention. Some of his recent headlines include, is coconut the new palm oil, palm versus coconut, what's more sustainable, and the dirty secret behind the West coconut fad. I'll let him go more into his field reporting and some early insights that he's gleaned over the past year. I don't know if we have video from him, but definitely we can. We have audio. Nitin, can you speak up and so we can hear from you? Thank you.
Great. I hope you guys can see me. But it's if you guys can hear me, that should be fine. There's nothing much to see at 1 a.m. in California. But it's my pleasure to be here. I'm really excited to see this coming together. I think I came across one of some of the notes from one of the early meetings about a year ago when this was still seemed to be kind of an idea that was you guys were all discussing, and now to see it kind of come and become an actual launched public project that's going to hopefully enable something unique and special in the coconut industry is really exciting, especially as a journalist who covers supply chains. It's always interesting to see how different industries approach these challenges and these problems. So we can go to the next slide, please. So I wanted to first talk about how I approach this. So I have been covering supply chains in Southeast Asia for several years now, and a lot of that focuses on palm oil. I initially really got into this covering the 2015 fires in Indonesia, which burned at that time more than 2 million hectares of plantations, forests, natural landscapes, and were a huge emitter of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. And palm oil was kind of blamed as one of the culprits of that disaster and of a lot of other kind of deforestation and kind of landscape degradation issues in not just Indonesia, but also Malaysia, and also expanding into other countries where palm oil is taking on a bigger footprint. And I kind of took the supply chain approach because I found it very interesting as a way to connect consumers in Western countries, where a lot of the audience I'm writing for is, with actually what's happening on the ground. And it's easy to paint palm oil or any commodity as to blame, but it's oftentimes missing a lot of the nuance, and I think it's something everyone here can probably understand. But one thing that kind of got me interested in coconut, if you go to the next slide, was palm oil had gotten so much negative attention, I think, that consumers were looking for alternatives. And because they kind of just had the idea palm oil is bad, I saw things like this where people were looking at, well, this is made with coconut instead of palm oil, so it must be better. Palm oil is very unsustainable. Coconut oil would be a great alternative. And that sounded great in theory, but I was wondering, I actually don't know much about the coconut industry. I don't know much about how sustainable is it. Is it really a sustainable alternative, or is it similar to palm oil and has a lot of the same issues, or is it something in the middle or something different? So I was very curious to, as I saw more of this kind of attention being given to alternatives to palm oil and more attention and seeing more coconut products for sale in the United States and also in Europe, I wanted to see like, what is sustainability in the coconut industry and how is it different from what I've seen in the palm oil industry? So next slide. So that's how I put together this proposal for the Pulitzer Center had a project looking specifically at tropical forests and kind of the different issues that tropical forests are facing. And I put together a proposal to kind of look at, is coconut, all the media attention is getting as a replacement for palm oil, is coconut actually on the ground a sustainable alternative? Does it have some of the same problems as palm oil, or is it something completely different? And I kind of went into this kind of as, with as much of an open mind as possible. I was an avid consumer of coconut products. People I spoke to were terrified that I would find something terrible out in the field, and they wouldn't be able to use coconut anymore. And that, to me, I didn't want to bring in that type of fear journalism to the story. I wanted to kind of like understand like what are the issues at play. And what I found was, quite surprising and not at all what I expected. Go to the next slide. You know, from my grocery store in the US, there were just so many more coconut products now than there were 10 years ago. So I was quite surprised to learn that, the actually coconut production is either stagnant or in some places is declining. Those products that I'd seen, virgin coconut oil, coconut water, organic kind of coconut products used in beauty and hair care, were actually a very tiny fraction of the market. And they actually were not what most farmers in Indonesia and the Philippines, where I did my field work, were actually producing. And I was very, very surprised. And I think something everyone here knows about these fears of a supply shortage. And I guess the other thing that really surprised me on the next slide was like how interconnected actually coconut oil, specifically coconut oil and palm oil were. So like coconut in Southeast Asia, where I was doing my most of my research and most of my field work, coconut is a heritage crop. It's been grown there, I think, as many of you know, for generations. Farmers that grow coconuts, these smallholders, have very long-term relationships with coconut. It's considered, people would always tell me like we consider this a tree of life because it provides so many products and benefits for families and for local communities. But over the last 30 to 40 years, people in the Philippines and Indonesia, I think Indonesia from several decades ago, but the Philippines more recently, had stopped using coconut oil and were using palm oil instead. I heard reports about people shifting their land from coconut production to palm production in places like Riau and Sumatra and in Mindanao Island. And comparatively, a lot of farmers and people I spoke with on the ground would complain to me how little support they were getting from the government. And I think this went to all various levels of the industry. There was no money for research. There wasn't money for help them be more productive. There wasn't money for planting. There wasn't support or technological training or even farm training. So there was a lot of, and a lot of the money, they felt at least, was going to palm oil. And the governments in these places were supporting palm more than coconut. So it was interesting for me to see how actually the supply chains, even if they're different, they're quite interconnected. So during my field visit, I got to visit several various kind of smallholder plantations and smallholder farms in different parts of the Philippines and Indonesia. And it also struck to me how much of a contrast there was between what was happening in one region and another region, just a few hundred kilometers or a few dozen kilometers away. So next slide. I was deeply surprised to see just how inefficient a lot of the processes and things I saw on the ground were. At this farm I visited in Quezon in the Philippines, they were just throwing the coconut water away because they had no, way to preserve it, no mechanism to store it, no way to actually get it to markets where it could be used. To me, that seemed wasteful. What I was paying $4 for in California, they were just throwing on the ground, and they weren't even making $4 a day. A lot of these farmers I met, because they were just eking out a bare living because coconut prices were so low, and they just had there were so many intermediaries between them and this kind of distant rural area and the major cities where people would actually process the coconuts. So next slide, please. And people, there was a lot, I was surprised, just it was a lot of manual labor. There was, very little, so a lot of these farmers had no electricity or limited electricity. There was no or very little technical tools or even kind of machinery. They were just doing everything very, very, very by hand. I didn't see a lot of, bad practices in terms of unsustainable practices, but I saw a lot of inefficiencies, and I saw a lot of opportunities to, I could see like if there were just better technologies and better practices and better opportunities for some of these farmers, they could just produce a lot more without any additional harm to the landscape or to the land around them. But they just needed that support and that kind of push that wasn't there. But some of the waste really surprised me. If you go to the next photo, I think this stunned me the most. These are just along the river in this region. There were just mounds and mounds of discarded coconut shells, and just you could see it you could just drive and see this for quite a while. And in a more logical economy, I feel like this could be used to make charcoal. It could be used to make some sorts of products that could be added economic value without any additional harm, actually, but the benefit to the environment, because all this waste here is not going to be good for the river and not good for the landscape. So I was quite surprised to see just how different kind of, I did not see the same kind of large scale unsustainable practices that I'd seen visiting palm oil plantations, certain palm oil plantations in Indonesia. I didn't see any evidence of deforestation directly because of coconut expansion. I didn't see bad practices such as burning of forests. I didn't see much, limited pesticide fertilizer use, but I think that was mostly because of lack of access to resources, or nor draining of wetlands. I saw coconut kind of mixing very well with the surrounding landscape and being intermixed with forest or with other crops. But what I did see was just a lot of waste, a lot of lack of capacity for farmers to care for these trees, a lot of inefficiency, and a lot of just farmers who had just gotten so fed up they weren't even taking care of their trees anymore because they were tired of paying very low, tired of getting incredibly low prices. So this is one plantation. If you go to the next slide, I also got a chance to visit a fair trade certified plantation. Next slide, please. So this plantation was certified by Fair Trade USA and Fair Trade Sustainability Alliance, also in the Philippines, maybe 100 kilometers from the other one, but it was like night and day. This one was an organic plantation. I saw how investment from these certification programs had allowed this community to invest in their farms to a much greater extent. The trees seemed healthier. There was a replanting program taking place so that they were putting in younger trees to replace the aging trees. They had funding to help with education programs. They were doing kind of agriculture training. It was it was a completely different atmosphere. And I think I saw here kind of how just a little bit of investment and a little bit of training made a huge difference in terms of sustainability. I go to the next picture. To me, it was just really, really clear, like how much healthier, how sustainable these farms were compared to the ones I visited earlier. There was no waste here. There was a lot of just, the landscape was very fresh and beautiful. It really was a completely different environment. And I think it shows kind of what I saw. There's like, for coconut, there's an opportunity of sustainability that, but has to be, it's going to take a lot of work, I think, to get there, because these certified plantations, they spent 5 to 7 to 10 years building to this point. So I think it really shows the work that needs to go in to help these farmers. So yeah, next slide. So just to wrap up, everywhere I went, there were just some really, really common concerns. I mean, I think I mentioned several times the lack of investment, the lack of support from government, the lack of support from industry, except for a few isolated cases. Aging trees, I think, is a systematic issue for families and in areas where they've just planting coconuts for generations. The fact that they've stopped at some point, I think, ties to a lot larger structural issues that need to be addressed. And I think these communities are also, I noticed issues with farmers. They don't want their children to be farmers anymore because they want their children or their next generation to have better opportunities. And that is also an issue. If you don't build sustainable communities in these farming regions, you're not going to have the next generation of people to actually grow coconuts. And that's also going to be a problem. So it's not just the trees, it's also, remember, the communities are also important to invest in. And then competition from palm oil, that was something that people brought up quite a bit. So next slide. So just some final thoughts. Like, I think in my reporting about palm oil, I think the challenge I saw there was shifting from unsustainable practices, just that actively destroyed landscapes, to sustainable practices, which is quite difficult. For coconut, I think the challenge will be, firstly, creating a market for sustainable products, and secondly, investing in farmers, investing in communities so they can improve their practices and be more sustainable and be part of a sustainable supply chain. And I would just caution something that I've seen quite a bit when we talk about sustainability is, we focus quite a bit on environmental issues, and I think that's landscapes and kind of the biodiversity, and that's really important. But don't forget labor and humans and communities. They're just as important to achieving sustainability. And I think biodiversity and strong communities and labor and human rights protections are directly interconnected. Sustainability is a process. You're never going to have a point where you are sustainable. You're always going to have to be adapting, growing and learning, and understanding and getting feedback from communities. I think it should be really important to make sure that these local communities, the farmers, the 98% of smallholders that grow coconuts around the world, they should be at the table. They should be involved as much as possible. And I've been told and I've seen that certification and sustainable initiatives that don't involve communities from the very beginning, I think are less likely to be successful. And then from my perspective as a journalist, be transparent, be willing to show your Hello, are you able to hear me? I think I might have been disconnected. But anyway, just last things. I look forward to seeing how this charter is implemented. I'm really excited to see the next steps. And I'm looking forward to learning more about what you're all doing and what you're all going to do through the rest of the session today. So thanks for having me. And I hope that to be a part of this as an outsider and observer. And I'm really interested to see kind of what the industry and what you will kind of bring forward when it comes to sustainability. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nitin, for that excellent scene setter. We couldn't have asked for a better overview of the challenges of the deep insights from the field and from a year's worth of research. There's a number of questions that have already come in, and we will be addressing them after our next speaker. So a number of the issues that you brought up, and actually one of the questions that came in is something that Eric Majard, our next speaker, will address. He's a conservation scientist focused on orangutan conservation and forest management. He chairs the International Union for Conservation of Nature, IUCN Oil Palm Task Force, a scientific group focused on the sustainability of vegetable oil production, including coconut. And I know that palm versus coconut perception issue is something that he's addressed through his scholarship, and we're eager to learn more. Over to you, Eric. Thank you.
Yes. Can you confirm that you can hear me?
Yes, I can, loud and clear.
All right, that's great. Thank you very much, Fung. Thank you very much, everyone a warm welcome, a very good afternoon, evening, morning from wherever you're calling in from. Very excited to be taking part in this launch of the Sustainable Coconut Charter. It's a topic that we haven't looked in very much so far. I represent the IUCN Oil Palm Task Force. The task force was set up specifically recognizing that the International Union for the Conservation of Nature felt that this highly complex and polarized debate around palm oil required more science and to inform more nuanced debate. So next slide, please. In our initial start of our work under the IUCN task force, we've started to focus on oil palm. And like Nitin was saying earlier, there are some very interesting parallels between oil palm and some important difference between palm oil and coconut. So the IUCN in their Congress in 2016 asked the IUCN members to form this new task force to start looking into both the socioeconomic as well as the biodiversity and environmental impacts of palm oil production. I was asked to chair that group in 2017, which I've been doing for the past 3 years. And one of the first things we did is we conducted this large study published in 2018 on oil palm and biodiversity, also available in French. And in 2019, we translated the study into Indonesian because Indonesia is the largest producer of palm oil. And what we try to do in a fully transparent and objective and neutral way is to review all the information that was available on this much studied topic of oil palm and biodiversity. And let's be very clear, by and large, palm oil production has been pretty bad for biodiversity, being produced often in tropical regions that were covered in tropical rainforests before they were converted to oil palm. So the past is where we looked at these impacts. What are the impacts on deforestation? What are the impacts on biodiversity? We also looked at the presence. To what extent do current governance, certification, and management address the concerns that people have about palm oil? And then we looked into the future, trying to work out under different scenarios of demand increase generally for vegetable oils, what role palm oil is likely to play, where would the crop likely expand, to what extent could increased production to meet increased demands be met by increasing yields, and to what extent would expanding the crop be required. And then if you're expanding the crop, oil crops to a certain extent are interchangeable. Are you going towards oil palm? Are you going to go towards soy or to rapeseed? So there's a lot of questions that we explore in those future scenarios. Where we currently find ourselves in terms of the task force is that we're expanding or extending our mandate for another 4 years, running from 2021 to 24. And we've really recognized that talking about palm oil, this is also what Nitin earlier referred to, is that you cannot really talk about these oils in isolation. They're very interconnected. Their global trade is interconnected. Different oils from different oil crops have different characteristics, and they are not 100% interchangeable, but there are also a lot of overlaps, and there's a lot of chemical manipulation of different oils possible that allows you to change one oil for another. So knowing that, we really need to understand the full environmental and socioeconomic impacts of all these oil crops. Next slide, please. And this is how I ended up looking at coconut. I've worked for the past 30 years primarily in Indonesia as a scientist and conservation practitioner, and I used to write a lot for newspapers, and it always struck me as kind of strange that people had this real hatred for palm oil, and everyone had that wonderful love for coconut. And I remember writing an article saying, well, if I was an oil palm tree, I'd be really quite annoyed with the positive attention that the coconut got. How much do we actually know about the differences? And Again, this is what Nitin was referring to earlier. Well, in fact, we don't know all that much. If you look at coconut, and these are based on FAO statistics of total area planted, the big producing areas are mostly in Asia, in the Philippines, Indonesia, and India, to a lesser extent in Africa, especially Tanzania, and also in South America, mainly in Brazil. It's a tropical crop. It's a crop that naturally occurs in coastal environments. The coconut is a floating seed that does really quite well dispersing across seas. So you find it across the tropical belts in pretty much similar growing conditions as oil palm. Nevertheless, of course, they are treated very differently in the public view, especially in the global north. I think one key difference in the production of oil palm and coconut is that coconut tends to be produced at much smaller scales. It's much more a smallholder crop compared to oil palm, which is often grown in areas of like 50,000 hectares, 100,000 hectares, 75,000 hectares. I think coconut is quite often grown in a couple of hectares, 3 or 4, even though larger areas such as shown in the picture above, top right, it does occur in these larger plantation settings. Next slide, please. So knowing where the crop is being produced, it's a tropical crop. And then looking from a conservation point of view, we started to see some interesting patterns. Areas of coconut production seem to spatially overlap with areas of high species endemism. If you look at this map here, going from the right to the left, Papua, Indonesian Papua and Papua New Guinea, the Philippines, central Indonesia, Sulawesi, islands like Sumba, Sumbawa, Halmahera, then going towards Africa, Madagascar, Tanzania, Kenya, the eastern coast of Brazil, into Central America and into Mexico. These are all important coconut producing areas. At the same time, there are also areas that are characterized by species with small ranges, especially some of the Pacific and Caribbean island ranges where there's a lot of coconut production. And there seems to be a rub there between what species experts that are concerned about particular species and the threat to these species and the spatial co-occurrence of coconuts. And if you go to the next slides, we toyed around with this idea a little bit in a paper that we published earlier this year that was much debated in the media, where we basically said, okay, let's look at all these species where species experts are saying this species is threatened by rapeseed, this species is threatened by peanuts or groundnut, this species is threatened by oil palm, olive, and as well as coconut. And then we translate that into the volumes of oil that are being produced by these different crops. And then you end up with a map like is shown here, where coconut suddenly stands out as being highly associated with species threat, according to the people that have assessed threats of each of the IUCN listed threatened species. Now, this can be seen in different ways. Of course, this has to do with the fact that coconut produces relatively small amounts of oil compared to oil palm. It's one of the lower yielding oil crops. Oil palm has very high yields, so on a relatively small area, as shown on the right, oil palm produces a lot of oil. So once you start translating that into number of species threatened by volume of oil, these ratios are showing something that is quite different from what people had expected. It doesn't tell us the full story. It just tells us about spatial overlap between species that are threatened by particular crops and where these crops are produced. Which takes me to my next slides. To be honest, from a scientific point of view, if we wanted to look at the environmental impacts of coconut and the environmental impacts of coconut on the impacts of coconut production on biodiversity, we just don't know very much. There are no accurate high-resolution maps of the coconut of the world. Such maps really only exist for oil palm. They don't exist for soy. They don't exist for rapeseed or any of the other major oil crops. So there's a need to develop these maps, and this can be done technologically quite easily. It just hasn't been done yet. Once we know where coconut is currently grown, where it's expanding or maybe even contracting, we can get some understanding of where coconut expansion has recently, or in the more distant past, had an impact on natural environments, on tropical forests, of course, but also on mangrove environments in coastal areas, and maybe even higher altitude forests where coconut is being produced on hills. Once we know that, we can start to quantify the environmental impacts. We can then also start looking at environmental cost and benefits. And this is, I think, something that's required to get a better understanding of where coconut stands sort of in this broader discussion around sustainability. And I think important to inform consumers who have a choice between different oils. When you're standing in your supermarket in front of your shelves, you can take that bottle, you can take that bottle, and consumers deserve to know what the impacts are of that choice. I had some interesting feedback from people working in coconut when we published our paper on coconut. Surprisingly, they were telling us the coconut industry could learn a lot from the palm oil industry, and which to me was a surprise. But they pointed out that in terms of production effectiveness, and this is something Nitin also referred to, governance, financial support from governments, research into yields, research into management, fertilizer input, any of these things, palm oil has, of course, moved tremendously over the past few decades, where maybe coconut is kind of lagging behind, and there might be interesting areas to explore. Similarly, also palm oil certification requires, under the Roundtable on Sustainable Palm Oil, requires strict identification and avoidance of areas of high carbon stock and high conservation value. It's not happening perfectly, certainly not, but at least the principles are there to ensure that indeed the expansion, if a crop is expanding into natural areas, is being avoided. So I think there's lessons to be learned from both sides, and I'd be happy on behalf of the Oil Palm Task Force to work with people on coconut, either on the scientific side to do further research, or on governance issues, learning from the different initiatives that exist in not just oil palm and coconut, but also other vegetable oil producing crops. And my next slide should be the last, and I wanted to thank you very much for that. Thank you.
Thank you for that excellent scientific step back, which we needed, and especially for addressing how applicable lessons are from palm oil sustainability efforts. We have a few minutes to take some of the questions that have already been put in through the Q&A. Thank you. Going back to the slide where you talked about how there aren't maps of where coconuts are grown. Sanjeev Lewis from Sail Ventures had a question, he's an investor, had a question about whether there's been research to look into how much actual land has been converted from coconut to palm. You said there are high resolution maps of palm, but do we understand about the conversion process? Eric.
No, so just to clarify, the map of oil palm was produced this year. I collaborated in a study with the Joint Research Center of the EU in Italy, and we produced that first study, which uses deep learning, artificial intelligence type approaches to map this crop. It's a small step from having that map to mapping other palms like sago and coconut, but that's not been done yet. So without having that information, we have to fall back on very low resolution maps like the one I showed you earlier in the slides, which is mapped, I think, on a 10 by 10 kilometer scale, which is not accurate enough to really say here is where coconut had been replaced by palm oil. Having said that, I would like to think that within a year we should have a global coconut map that allows us to do these kind of analyses relatively easily, but it's not available and not possible yet as far as I'm aware. Okay.
Have you done field work in the Philippines, Eric?
I've done field work on the Philippines, but on a completely different topics. So not on either coconut or oil palm. I was working on wild pigs in the Philippines.
Okay. We have a question that I'm afraid we won't be able to get to, where a colleague is asking for more information about best practices that Nitin observed in the field. He addressed it somewhat through the fair trade certified farm he visited, through farmers and producers' investments in their farms, but that's something that we hope to go more into in the event report. But a final question, this is more an existential long-term development question for organizers of the roundtable, is, as we know, the charter right now is not a certification system, right? It's a voluntary set of criteria to align buyers' requirements for their suppliers. But a question came in, is the long-time goal a certification system similar to RSPO? And that's for the roundtable to meet annually to decide. But I'm curious what Barry Callebaut and USAID Green Invest Asia have to say at this point, at the launch. Over to Christy and to Barry Callebaut, please.
Thanks, Fung. I think that is something that's been discussed, but as you note, it's a longer term goal. I think it's taking lessons from RSPO, the amount of time and effort that goes into that. So I think that requires some further conversation with the founding signatories, as well as with others within the community who would see that as advantageous or not.
Okay, thank you, Christy. And does anyone from Barry Callebaut want to speak to that, or anyone?
Yeah, maybe just as a comment. I mean, to me, whether voluntary or, well, RSPO is voluntary as well, I think it just helps in transparency and getting people, whether it's consumers or buyers, to think more carefully about what sustainability even means, both on the environmental as well as on the social side. It provides you with tools to increase transparency, maybe to provide the good producers, or provide an opportunity to differentiate between the good producers and the less good producers. And whether it's going to head towards the charter, towards a full certification system, that would require a lot of time. But I think they're all just systems to be put in place to provide information and transparency, so we can all step away from the generalizations and the claims that are being made in today's sort of very generalized media, where either it's an evil or it's wonderful. No, you need nuance and you need understanding. And I think these kind of charters and certification criteria allow you to start working towards that.
All right, thank you for that. And I think it's a really appropriate end to a very informative session. A big thanks to Eric and to Nitin. Nitin joining in the middle of the night from California, and to Eric joining us. I will turn it back over to Christy, but before I do so, I'd encourage you to please continue submitting questions through the Q&A, even if we're moving on to the next session. Every question will be addressed in the follow-up event report. Thank you very much, and back to you, Christy.
Thanks, Fung. So without further ado, let's move forward to our next session, kind of continuing on this theme of coconut charter and coconuts and the pillar of environment around deforestation and climate change. Our next speaker, if I could have the next slide, is Matthew Chamont. He is the Director of Sustainable Sourcing with Harmless Harvest and is based here in Bangkok. Upon his move to Thailand from Harmless Harvest's San Francisco headquarters, Matthew launched the company's organic and fair trade program. He is passionate about sustainability. I've heard him speak recently, and I'm really thrilled that he's able to join us today and talk a little bit about regenerative agriculture in coconut production and how that contributes to a climate benefit. So Matthew, I'll let you take it from here. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Christy, for the introduction. It's really a pleasure to be here to discuss how regenerative agriculture can help us cool down the planet. Before we get started, I'd like to thank USAID, Green Invest Asia, and Barry Callebaut for spearheading this initiative. I remember being part of the very first discussions a little more than 2 years ago with Gregory Bodies and then with Nacha Tul Yasu, and I can really appreciate the hard work done to take us to actually launching the charter today. Next slide, please. So a little bit very quickly about Harmless Harvest. So Harmless Harvest is the leading premium coconut water brand in the US. We also have a whole line of delicious coconut meat-based products, such as spoonable yogurt, drinkable yogurt, protein drinks, and smoothies. The company is 10 years old, and sustainability is coded in its DNA, in its vision, and its mission. We operate a factory here in Thailand, and we're working with hundreds of coconut farmers. Next, please. So, probably as most of you, I pretty much heard about climate change, melting ice in the Arctic, and primary forests being burned my whole life. But everything seemed quite far and out of my grasp. And then something changed in my life 407 days ago with the most rewarding turn with the birth of my son. And the week before, I was visiting a farm where the farmer had lost 40% of his soil and sediments to erosion. And the next morning, I look at my reusable bamboo straw and my organic fruit salad and realize I would need to do and learn much more to combat climate change. Suddenly became much more aware of my responsibility and the one of our generation to leave our planet a better place than we found. So today we're going to discuss how we can all contribute in a very significant way to cooling down the planet, hopefully before the end of our time on Earth. Next, please. So these pictures were taken in Thailand in 2020. The impact of climate change on farmers and coconut production is real. We just had 2 years of heavy drought, the heaviest drought in 50 years, followed by very heavy rainfalls and floodings in October. Our farmers in Ratchaburi province were flooded as recently as 3 weeks ago, and it lasted for a week before water disappeared, moved out. And weather patterns and water cycles are really being disrupted. We see seasons that are not happening at the regular time. Our coconut over the last 2 years were 30% less and 12% smaller than 2 years ago. So that's a very significant impact on production and on businesses. Next, please. So the reason for that are pretty well known. Human population grew from 1 to 7 billion people in 220 years, and we're expected to reach 10 billion people by 2050. Industrialization, agriculture, land clearing, and our massive usage of fossil fuel released 136 gigatons of carbon in the atmosphere. And we lost a third of our farmable land in 40 years due to our agricultural practices through monocropping, tilling, and farming plants and animals separately. So far, technology, GMO, vertical farms, and other innovations have not delivered the expected breakthrough to address the challenge on time. And usually it requires to extract enormous amount of new resources from our planet. So how can we solve the challenge of feeding human population under these conditions when we know that 75% on land on Earth is degraded? Next, please. The depth of what needs to be done to solve global warming is overwhelming. Most organizations are now busy assessing their own emissions using GHG protocol, life cycle assessment, and others. Most countries are pledging carbon neutrality by 2050 or so. Unfortunately, the startup of all this is pretty slow, and we're already late. So I hope the Sustainable Coconut Charter will really lead the way and accelerate that change, because there's a lot we can do here. Next, please. So good news for the private sector. Our consumers demand change, are ready for change, and give priority to sustainable brands. Gen Z, millennials prefer to buy from sustainable brands and are ready to pay a premium for it. Understanding that doing things the right way is a cost, they're willing to pay that price, a higher price. Next, please. The target is known and it's clear. We need to reduce the carbon dioxide concentration in the atmosphere by at least 65 ppm by 2050. We increased it, so for most of mankind and human history, we're around 280 ppm. and we brought it to 415. So we need, and that's most scientists agree that we need to bring it back below 350 ppm to bring it to a safer place. Now, if we were to stop all emissions today, atmosphere would still continue to heat up for decades or centuries due to current concentration. So we really need to draw back and remove carbon from the atmosphere to be able to revert climate change. Next, please. Yes, thank you. Agriculture contributes to 30% of direct greenhouse gas emissions. That's including accounting for deforestation. So it's a very large carbon emitter when we would mostly expect that it has quite positive effect. The good news is most of us gathered here today can play an important and critical role in addressing this issue and turning things around. It's worth noting that despite such a high contribution in emission, only 3% of climate finance goes to agriculture. And this started to change, but that's still bad. Next, please. So if we continue agriculture as we know it, there is no stopping global warming. There will be not enough food for all human population since, as I said, 75% land on Earth is already degraded. We're losing the topsoil at a very fast pace. Next, please. And we have 60 harvests left. According to the US, 60 years of plant-based food, given the pace at which we lose our topsoil and sediments to erosion. If we use soil-sustaining practices, we will not achieve our carbon sequestration target. Next, please. So we need to regenerate our soils. We need to rebuild the topsoil, the humus layer, the organic matter, to ensure we can feed global population. And by doing so, we can fix enough carbon to revert global warming by the end of our lifetime. Next, please. So by using the plant biomass in a different way, by changing the way we treat our soil and the way we do agriculture, we can draw enough carbon into the soil to revert climate change. And before this happens, these practices will increase farmer resilience, secure food production, and the agricultural supply chains. Interesting statistic, if all farmland on Earth was converted to regenerative farming and carbon building practices, it would take less than 5 years to hit the target of 106 gigatons of carbon drawn down back into the soil. Next, please. So what is regenerative farming? It's a set of quite basic principles. Basically, it's a reversion of the so-called green revolution practices. It's rebuilding biodiversity on our farmland. The coconut farm of tomorrow, and I said tomorrow, I'm not saying farm of the future because it needs to happen fast, will be a farm where we also grow other crops, high-value trees, fruit crops, legume. This will challenge, obviously, our collection models and our business models. Our harvest will not be as optimized as today, and our cost of goods may even increase. But the monocrop model has shown its limit and its impact, and we need to rebuild our soil to sequester carbon. Next, please. Regenerative farming is also growing cover crops to open up our soil, to let it breathe, to reduce compaction, to enhance the sponge effect, to absorb and retain moisture. If we're going to get rain less often because of climate change and different seasonal patterns, if rainfalls are going to be stronger, soil has to be ready to absorb it before it evaporates. So we need to keep our soil as cool as possible, as covered as possible, and as moist as possible to regulate the temperature and to optimize yield and coconut production. Next, please. Last but not least, regenerative farming also means farming animals and plants together. Factory farming of animals is a very significant carbon emitter, whereas combining plants and animals in farms together can have many positive effects on product quality, ecosystem balance, and carbon emission. Next, please. So now I would like to talk about our approach to regenerative agriculture in coconut farms. A couple of years ago, we started working on the project that we just launched, which is named RECAP, standing for Regenerative Coconut Agriculture Project. It aims at exploring and defining the most suitable regenerative farming models in our local and specific context. We secured funding, engaged with experts from research centers and local universities. We chose GIZ to collaborate on the project implementation, and we just launched our first pilot. It is a 750,000 euros project over 3 years for the first phase. Next, please. So we've been training our pilot farmers for 5 days on many topics, from soil health, intercropping and cover cropping, use of pollinators and beekeeping to generate additional sources of revenue, holistic pest management, and compost soil amendment through compost and vermicompost. The idea here was really to create a curriculum where they would benefit through lectures and through meeting experts and going on the field to see a different reality from what they are accustomed to learn and to be inspired so that they could come up with their own idea of how they would start implementing regenerative farming practices in their own farm. Next, please. And so the way we did it is really to work collaboratively with them, so that at the end of the whole courses, the whole curriculum, they would be presenting and making the commitment, and that's how we wanted them to be engaged, to making the commitment to the whole group about what they would be doing in the farms. Next, please. So this is Koen Kopp. I met him 2 or 3 years ago. And by then, his farm was pretty much like all the other farms. There was no cover crop, bare land, a lot of soil erosion. And so very often they would take the mud from the canal and put it back on top of their soil to rebuild, to bring moisture, to manage weed, and to rebuild the the land on which the coconuts are growing. And with the help of one of our agronomists, he started planting that small cover crop and spending every day an hour or so replanting and spreading that cover crop to the farm. He's now covered the whole farm. And then when it started happening, his mother came and other farmers came and called him crazy for thinking that all those cover crops were competing for nutrients with the coconut, thinking his farm was not clean. And he was invited to speak to a convention with other farmers, and everybody was mocking him basically for growing cover crops in his farm. A couple of years ago, that's next picture. Next picture, please. Next slide, please. So this was last month, 2 years later, where he's now speaking to farmers who are willing and gain conscious of the importance of changing their agricultural practices. After 2 years of drought, they realize that something has to be done differently if they are to preserve their sources of revenue, if they want to be more resilient, and if they want to adjust to lower rain and very heavy rain when it eventually comes. He's a speaker at our training program, and it was very inspiring to see him share his very specific knowledge of how he's managing water, land, and resources, basically showing us that we're going in the right direction, even though there's still a lot to learn. Regenerative farming is quite new. There is a lot to learn on what's happening with coconut farming and how to do it right with dwarf coconut, high-yielding dwarf coconut. But that's really inspiring, and we expect that this pilot will start yielding very good results within the next 18 months, so that we can then roll out the program and scale it up with our other farmers. And that's it for me, really to remind everyone that business as usual will not solve global warming and will not ensure a sustainable supply chain. We need to regenerate our soil if we are to protect, secure our supply chain and protect our farmers.
Thank you, Matthew, for that. And I think it's interesting that, some people will say, oh, the coconut industry doesn't have a big impact on climate change, doesn't have a big carbon emissions. But I think one of your messages is in this day and age, every little bit helps, and that the coconut industry does have a role to play in mitigating the impacts of climate change. And your example is one way. I just want to ask a couple of quick questions that came through the Q&A box, but I do encourage you to, after we're finished, just to go through and answer anyone's offline if you like. One is the RECAP project open to new additional partners? And if so, what would be required?
Oh, that's not something we've considered yet, but we'd be very happy to look into that and how we can share that. It's an open source project, meaning that our findings will be shared because we believe that this practice needs to be spread as much as possible. But we're more than happy to take any application. I don't know if people have my email somewhere after this event.
We can provide it. Yep.
Yeah, more than happy to continue the discussion and to see how we could do that and how we apply it to different reality. Like, it's not going to be done in the Philippines, Indonesia, and Thailand the same way. So we need to consolidate these learnings to guide the industry.
Great. And then last question for you before we turn to the charter signing itself. What kind of overcrops do you use or introduce? What were you using?
That's also, I don't know the Latin name and the scientific name, but we have a list of 5 different cover crops that can be used. They are of different height and obviously different capacity of carbon nitrogen fixing capacity. But that's also something I can provide after the meeting. That's something very easy to do.
Great, and thank you so much, Matthew. Again, your passion comes through and some really great lessons and recommendations there, and I appreciate your time today.
Thank you, Christy.
Okay, so next is on the agenda is the signing ceremony and endorsement. I think, as you can well imagine, organizing a virtual signing ceremony is a bit challenging. So I'm very grateful that the founding signatory companies, AAK, Barry Callebaut, Friesland Campina, Harmless Harvest, Nestle, and Unilever, were all able to contribute a commitment statement, either in video or in writing, endorsing the Sustainable Coconut Charter. And we'll be sharing those with you. And just as a reminder, the Coconut Charter is something that is defining ambition and principles of coconut sustainability programs, aiming to have the following impacts around local livelihoods, promoting the values and initiatives that increase smallholder farmers' income and subsequently their livelihoods, through traceability and transparency. We engage stakeholders to enhance supply chain transparency and traceability through sustainable and efficient sourcing and processing, production and other related value chain strategies. And lastly, the pillar of deforestation and climate change, that we strive to prevent deforestation and mitigate climate change. So I'd like to go then to the first, so from AAK, this is Tim Stevenson. Can you play the video? There we go.
In 2017, AAK identified coconut as a key component in our sustainability programme. Since then, we've been working with suppliers to engage, to transform, and to understand more deeply the issues around sustainability in coconut. As a founder member and an ever-present on the board of the Roundtable for Sustainable Palm Oil, we understand very well that it takes a long time and industry collaboration in order to make the real changes to transform the industry. Therefore, we're very happy to join and sign up to the Coconut Savvy Charter, together with other members of the industry, with processors, growers, and end users, in order to achieve some momentum, in order to really make better sustainability in coconut happen. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And next we have a statement from Massimo Selmo, who's the global head of sourcing for Barry Callebaut. I'll just read that for those who are not able to see for whatever reason. The charter is an important milestone on the way to improving coconut cultivation and farmer livelihoods. I am pleased we have succeeded in bringing together key players and stakeholders at one table. This is a challenge that must be tackled together to be successful. It's great to hear this coming from Massimo. He joined us in the first roundtable meeting back in 2019. And so I'm glad that he's able to help see this through. Our next, please, from Mark Stolzenbach, who's the Managing Director of Food and Beverages with Friesland Campina. And again, we're an international dairy company owned by a cooperative of farmers, so we understand the challenges of making farming more sustainable and future-proof very well. A good living for farmers is crucial to overcome these challenges. Friesland Campina therefore fully supports the Coconut Charter and will be actively participating to positively impact farmer livelihoods, mitigate climate change, and prevent deforestation in the coconut supply chain. Next, we're happy to have a statement from Harmless Harvest. Maybe Matthew, would you like to read that since it's from you?
Please go ahead. It's going to be more.
At Harmless Harvest, our vision is a world where the climate impact of coconut farming is net positive. We are committed to ensure coconut agriculture supports communities and enhances livelihoods, prevents deforestation, and combats global warming thanks to regenerative practices. We partnered with other actors in the industry to deliver the Sustainable Coconut Charter, hoping to accelerate the implementation of innovative sustainable practices around the world and to enable the sharing of knowledge. Next, our statement from Nestlé, from Benjamin Ware, who is the global head of sustainable sourcing. Quote, we are proud to be collaborating with our peers in USAID Green Invest Asia in the development of the first industry standard for the sustainable sourcing of coconuts. This is part of our broader responsible sourcing program that aims at ensuring a transparent, sustainable, and resilient agricultural supply chain. And last, but definitely not least, is our statement from Unilever, Martin Huxtable, who's the Director of Sustainable Sourcing, who notes that with the demand for coconut-based ingredients increasing, it is imperative the industry find ways to meet that demand sustainably. The creation of the Coconut Charter is a timely and important step in the right direction. So if we go to our next slide, I think, you know, and again, the next slide, for those who have not read the charter, it is available on the Sustainable Coconuts Charter website. I think the message that is clear from all of the founding signatories is the importance and the timing of this Coconut Charter is impeccable, and that the support is strong. We commend the leadership of these 6 companies as those to others who wish to sign on this journey toward a more sustainable future for the coconut industry and the coconut farmer. In the coming weeks, we'll be adding others from the industry who would also like to lend their weight to actualizing the spirit of this charter to secure a future for sustainable coconuts. So maybe we don't need to turn our mics, but I do hope you join in a round of applause for this momentous occasion. It is a milestone, as many have noted. This is the first of its kind. There is a lot of work to do, and part of that work comes to actually actualizing it. As I think many people note, without the commitment is one thing, but a commitment without action leaves something to be desired. So on that note, what I would like to do is turn it over, move on to our next session, which is with Matthias Reddick, the Chief Technical Advisor with GIZ. Over the last, and we can go to the next slide, over the last couple of roundtables, we've welcomed GIZ to provide updates on their coconut programs in the Philippines. And we've seen an evolution of design and engagement, which is actually quite exciting. And today, Matthias will be able to share a bit more on the progress in the design and launch of the public-private partnership project, which is being launched for the Philippines, and contains or includes many of the signatories of the charter today, as well as others who are equally interested in the charter and in sustainable coconuts more broadly. So Matthias, I'll just hold there and turn it over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Christy. Can you hear me well?
Yes.
Yes. So thank you very much for having us. Also on behalf of GIZ, we are very happy to be again invited to this roundtable. And just as it was mentioned earlier, we are really excited about this drive that has been developing over the past years from the first Coconut Roundtable with many meetings, calls in between to shape action. And my interest today is to share with you a few updates where we stand on the preparation of the new public-private partnership for the Philippines for sustainable coconut production, and elaborate a bit how this goes hand in hand with the Coconut Charter and how we see to make change in the field happen, and how we feel we can verify it as well, as this was one of the questions that were risen earlier. So, as many of you know, we have been on a long journey of discussions. Our plans were different. Our plans were that we would meet in person, have joint workshops in which we would meet personally and elaborate the project. While this is not possible, as everyone knows these days, we are doing everything online, but there's progress. And so we would want to share with you where do we stand currently and underline our support to the sector. So next slide, please. So I tried to boil it down just to the very basic facts. So what are we looking at? We are now at preparing a 4-year initiative, which where the goal is to improve sustainability of coconut oil production in key coconut production areas in the Philippines. We are aiming at directly reaching about 10,000 farmers, but we are looking at upscaling this initiative in the long term and reach more regions throughout the country later on. The first start is a budget of roughly 6 million euro that will be available for this partnership. Next, please. Just to briefly reiterate, what are the goals of this partnership? As we said, of course, there's an overarching charter, which we are supportive of, but we want to make action, and we want to create action and impacts on farmer level. So this project, while being aligned with the charter, will do certain activities to increase farmers' income. So we have seen exciting, I think, impressions from the Harmless Harvest project, for instance, how impact can be generated. So in our PPP partnership, we will prepare farmer trainings which relate, of course, of good agricultural practices, where soil is one of the important aspects of. But other than that, we will also build on the expertise and experiences we have from previous projects, supporting farmers on their entrepreneurial mindset as well, to produce more effectively, more to maximize yields and incomes from their farm, not only from coconut, but also from intercrops that we, of course, introduced. Aside from farmer level impact, which will be also accompanied by demo plots development and concrete stakeholder dialogues on a local level with the farming communities, we are also aiming at really creating a scheme that can, on a landscape level, assess sustainability. What does that as we've presented earlier of our achievements that we had through the Sustainable Certified Coconut Oil Project that was mainly
Matthias seems to be frozen. Let's see if he
certifying farms on is definitively of benefit for smallholder farmers. We have an alliance now that has so many partners that are sourcing so big volumes that a farm level certification for each of the farmers would not be technically feasible. And therefore we want to use a landscape approach in which a landscape is defined and assessed according to sustainability criteria, and where later on claims also can be made based on the sustainability performance on landscape level. I'll say a few words about this later. Of course, and that's what we always are aiming at as GIZ, we do not just want to create impact through the project on farm level, but we also want to support also, let's say, the country's support to the sector. And of course, the last level is we want to strengthen and further boost the sector dialogue that has been initiated through platforms such as this. And we want to also, in the long term, when maybe funding from others might end, take a position in terms of supporting dialogue fora like this, or the sustainability, or the Roundtable for Sustainable Coconut and Coconut Oil. Next, please. Next slide, please. Yeah. So who are our partners? So currently we have 6 multinational company partners confirmed. So we are working together with Barry Callebaut, Nestle, Friesland Campina, JDE, Procter & Gamble, and Bunge. And we are also still aligning with Unilever and Cargill and other companies. And we think that there might be even more partners to join the initiative. And since last time when we were presenting this, we have also initiated and institutionalized, I would say, the collaboration with the Philippine government side, namely through the Philippine Coconut Authority. So the PCA, as it's called in short, is now also part of our body, which aligns and elaborates the final project concept. And PCA will be strongly partnering with us on the ground, and we are very happy that we are not just, let's say, a development agency from German or international development agency with private sector partners, but that there's a strong player on the ground in the Philippines with interests and commitment and great prospects to work together, as we did in previous collaborations with PCA as well. So this is the rough setup that we are looking at. If we go to the next slide. There were the questions were asked. So how do we go about sustainability? Of course, a charter is something very important. It creates guiding principles for the industry, for a large number of stakeholders that may be engaging newly in sustainability efforts in the coconut sector. So yeah, these principles are key, of course. And these will be, so to say, also our guiding principles in this PPP project. So the charter will guide us. While at the same time, it was also mentioned, and I think it was Eric who asked, okay, so how are you going to measure sustainability? And that's something that needs to be worked out. Charter alone cannot do that. So what we are preparing in our consortium with our company partners and is the land scale sustainability assessment. I'm not sure who of you is familiar with land scale. Just to summarize it very briefly, land scale is an initiative of many international bodies that are working in the certification and biodiversity sectors. So it's headed mainly by Rainforest Alliance, Vera, and Conservation International. And they, together with a large number of a sounding board, advisory boards from private sector representatives and NGOs, created a scheme that allows for measuring sustainability on a landscape level. So meaning you pick, for instance, a landscape, say, can be an administrative landscape, a municipality, or a region, or a number of municipalities where, for instance, coconuts are being produced. And then according to certain sustainability criteria, of course, in the entirety of sustainability, meaning not just the environmental component, but also social and governance issues are being addressed with a set of indicators. And these are being assessed on a landscape level. Together with that, you also define in the project specific indicators that you report against. So besides this generic, let's say, setup of indicators, you define key priority areas where you want to measure your project's impact. So this can be things like, for example, areas free of deforestation. It can be social aspects like child labor that is being taken care of or avoided. So there's an additional set of criteria towards which the consortium then can report. And together with all our partners, we will be basically, I have to say, developing this strategy and this assessment tool for the coconut sector. Because currently it's looking really at the landscape lens. So with the entirety of economic and agricultural activities that are going on in the space. And we will now deliberately with the partnering bodies here develop a scheme how we can do this for our coconut areas. If we look at the next slide, please. Just to say, how can these assessments be done and what is the output? So first of all, to really measure the sustainability impact and also the sustainability challenges if you start working in a certain area is you take this certain assessment framework, which I was referring to, and you develop a verification mechanism. So you need to select your data that are reporting to those indicators from which you can then derive your need for action and do specifically training activities for farmers, for instance, tailored to those needs that you find out. And last but not least, the goal is, of course, also for companies to be able to report the volumes that they are sourcing from landscapes that are by then hopefully sustainable. And so there's a reporting platform, web-based, made available, where partners can really claim on what are the volumes they are sourcing from sustainable landscapes. I know this is a very much abbreviated depiction of what we are planning to do, but maybe it gives a little bit of insights already. And to say this is really a piloting effort, because land scale is new. Those things were not yet done in the coconut sector. And as we discussed and are in agreement, all of us earlier, I would say, also Nitin mentioned it nicely earlier, is we need to start somewhere, and the challenges are big, and we together want to address them in this PPP, and we are excitedly looking forward to embark on this endeavor. Currently, we are at the stage that we are finalizing our project concept, which will then receive the final approval by our ministry for funding. And aside from that, the preparation of contracts will start soon with the companies that are joining. And we are looking forward to start this project early next year. And we are looking forward to create good impacts and make good things happen, not only in the project areas, but also beyond. Last slide, next please, is you might ask, where will this project work? So as mentioned earlier, we have agreed that we will start in the Philippines, where most of our company partners are sourcing from. We have made an internal assessment on supply basis. Where do our partner companies, where are they sourcing from? And based on this, we will select at least 2 regions where this project will work on. And most likely we will start with a pilot area in Mindanao, start the efforts there, and then define a second area that would be added in the course of the project. This is in a very brief summary where we stand. And yeah, I would again like to thank USAID also for having us, for constantly working together with us on this. And as well, and this is really something what we appreciate, is that yeah, donor or development actors work hand in hand. And so one of our next steps, and that's something what we will be doing together with USAID and our partners, is we will do a first sustainability assessment in some of our project areas, where we will measure what are the sustainability gaps according to land scale indicators, and also what is the carbon, let's say, baseline of the farms we are looking at, so that our efforts could also be guided not only from a social and environmental impact perspective directly on farm level, but also address the topic of carbon dioxide sequestration. Thank you very much, and I'm happy to answer questions if there are any. Thank you.
Thanks, Matthias. As usual, it's always a pleasure to hear the updates and progress you're making, especially because I feel like we've been at it since the very beginning and kind of with you on your journey as you develop this very ambitious program, but one I think we're all anxious to hear about and the outcomes. I wanted to ask you, since we have a little bit of time, there's one question came in through the chat, which was directed at the panelists more broadly, but I'm curious in the terms that you're kind of developing this project. It's around the SDGs, and you're looking at the KPIs and the importance of measuring. To what extent do you see the coconut industry and potentially through your pilot program kind of contributing to the UN SDGs? I think you touched on it a little bit, but maybe more specifically kind of what because again, some of the corporate players that you're working with have their own targets tied to the SDGs. So how do you see that all kind of wrapping into a nice package?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you for that question. So definitively all our efforts of a development actor needs to be guided by the SDGs. So explicitly we will be working towards those. I would name, for instance, I think first of all, contribution to income and fight against, let's say, poverty and hunger would be, let's say, the first SDGs I would name, because income of smallholder coconut producers is really at the core of the efforts if we want to talk about sustainability. Of course, SDGs on partnerships would be also, of course, tackled, as well as yeah, partly SDG on life on land, or also maybe even if we talk about aquatic resources that are in the vicinity of our areas, we would address SDGs towards those. So definitively will be tackled and will be also stated in the project concept.
Great, good. Yeah, no, I think that there's a lot that your project can contribute to those. And since I have you, we have a couple more minutes, if anything else comes through, but one of the fundamental kind of pillars of what you're doing is partnership. And I'm wondering, you heard Graham's kind of tips on partnership in the beginning, his open remarks. And I'm wondering, do those resonate with you? I mean, the need for critical mass, the aligning of people, the criticalness of measurement. Have you seen those sort of being actualized as you put this very complex partnership together?
Thank you for the question, Christy, and I can just subscribe to that. I see, of course, it comes with also challenges, right? We cannot say that if you work on a project with one company, it's of course easy to set it up. If you work with an alliance, it's of course, it requires more alignment and things like that. But we are strongly believing that only through a bigger partnership, we can create a bigger change. And therefore, we are not only happy to partner with our, let's say, a selected number of companies that are subscribing to this project, but also are very open to act together with players like you are, like Croatia, like the Philippine Coconut Authority and others that contribute to the sector.
Thank you.
So,
and my last question for you before I wrap things up. This is kind of, I know you're still in the beginning stages, but I'm quite sure you have a vision. I'm wondering what you envision as the optimal outcome of this effort. You know, when this is done, what would you like to say this project achieved X, Y, and Z? What would be optimal for you?
Mhm. Okay, yeah, so that's a multi-layered question, I would say. So let's say the first level would be for sure farmer impact. So we really want that farmers benefit from that project, have more productive plantations, have a more sustainable dealing with their natural habitat and their agricultural habitat they are working in. Increasing their incomes and seeing a longer term perspective in coconut. I mean, this is really a critical aspect of all of this. We are, of course, all excited to support the sector development, but coconut prices are really the essential driver, and coconut prices will determine a lot of what we are doing. So meaning to say, yes, we have to build a system that allows for income generation on farmer level, that if we can create a strong case, which can be replicated. And what we are eyeing at, by the way, to do this together with the Philippine Coconut Authority, to replicate those models also in the regular government support structures, would be one very nice output for me. Another one on the sustainability level, let's say in sector level, would be that we have a system in place that, and this is one of our goals really, that this project does not end after 4 years and everyone walks home and goes away and nice reports are published and with nice pictures, but we want really that there's commitment behind from the private sector side to source sustainably and to adhere to those principles, and to further on nurture this initiative, not only through, let's say, pouring money into sustainability measures, farmer trainings and the like, but also really sourcing and acknowledging through sourcing the final and better and more sustainable product at the end of this initiative in the long term.
Thank you, Matthias. We'll all be standing by and watching you and supporting you as you go through this, so thank you. Okay, I think if I go to the next slide, that wraps us up for the day. We have had the pleasure to have you all with us today. As noted, with similar charters for other industries, what matters most is what comes next to putting these commitments into action. As Oliver noted in the beginning, this is the beginning of a journey. It's an important step in this journey towards this level of collaboration and focus for a more sustainable coconut commitment. But it's not the challenge for just one company, it's the challenge for an industry, which will require identifying partnerships, keeping in mind those points from Graham and the experiences thus far from GIZ. It'll require partnerships that are able to co-invest into some very ambitious initiatives and some things that are cutting edge, like what Harmless as Harvest is doing here in Thailand, within the supply chain in order to truly transform the coconut sector from one on the brink to one that flourishes and becomes a model of sustainability across the board, learning from some lessons out of the oil palm industry and others that we certainly don't, I think the sector does not want to replicate. And I may say that as a convener of the Sustainable Coconut Initiative, USAID Green Invest Asia stands ready to work with you to move this platform forward with positive change. Before I go, I would like to thank all of the participants for joining. We've had a tremendous turnout, a lot of interest. The speakers, and of course the speakers, for taking the time and effort to share their thoughts. And a special thank you to Grow Asia's Pranav for behind the scenes support today. It goes without saying, a big thank you to Barry Callebaut's Greg and Nacha for their significant contributions to launching this coconut charter, to getting where we are today. And of course, to the team at USAID Green Invest Asia, Art in particular today, for an excellent organization of all the different pieces. This is really tremendous. I think each event gets better each time. I see Greg's comment and I agree, it's the best one yet. So we've set the bar and we'll keep going. For those of you who would like a copy of the recording or just more information about the Sustainable Coconut Initiative, if you go to the next slide, please. Yep. You can visit the Sustainable Coconut Charter. That's the URL. They're visible to you. And if you have any specific questions, feel free to reach out to Art. His email is the one on the top, Packed World, or Natcha. She's with Barry Callebaut, and they'll be helpful to answer any questions. So thank you again for your time and interest. And with that, I'm going to sign off and wish you all a good evening and a good afternoon. Thank you very much.